Everybody, welcome back. In this next example, we're going to continue to get familiar with p5play. And in this one, we're going to focus on the mouse a little bit more. So do an example where there's some mouse interaction. Again, we'll get some practice with sprites and some of the sprite attributes as they relate to the physics simulation. So let's just get into it. So just to recap, right, we're going to be using the p5play library here in our code. And just like we did in the previous example, we are going to include the library by grabbing these two lines here on the p5play website, these two links to the both scripts required for the library to work. We're going to go to our index file, and after we include p5, we're simply going to paste these two scripts and save the file, and then go back into our sketch. And this is how we include libraries in general in p5.js. There's more libraries that exist other than p5.play. In a later video, perhaps this term, we might look into some of the other libraries that are out there, but this p5play is the one we're using this week. Okay? So let's set our canvas, and instead of using create canvas, because we are inside p5play, we're going to use this new canvas object. Okay? All right, so just like we did in the previous example, we're going to make a variable here that's going to contain our sprite, and we're going to call this one a block. We're going to make our variable block equal to a new sprite, and we're going to set the width of the block. So W is short for width. Let's set it to, let's say 200, and then we'll set block height is going to be equal to, I don't know, 40. What does that look like? Okay. By default, we get a random color, right? So let's set the stroke to white and fill to black. Okay, just for this example. Okay. All right, so we have a block object here. Now, one thing we haven't done yet is we haven't talked about sort of global physics settings. So oftentimes it can be interesting if you're programming in a physics simulator to add something like a force that gets applied to everything in your world to simulate something like, let's say, gravity. Okay, so p5play allows us to do that. It has this built-in object called the world, and the world has a gravity attribute to it. And then we could set the y value, the y attribute for the gravity. If we want something to be going down, for example, let's try a value of 10. Okay? So you can see that if we apply a gravity of 10, now all of a sudden the objects in our world that we create are all going to get pushed down to the bottom of the screen. So let's prevent our block here from falling too far down the bottom. We're going to add a floor. Okay, so let's add a ground here. We'll make a new sprite. Let's call this the ground. Okay, and we'll make this into a new sprite. Now, as we've seen in the previous example, right, we can create a sprite like this, or we can also provide the parameters directly into the constructor, right? So instead of setting it like here, we can just say this sprite is going to fill the width of the window. Sorry, that's its location, so it's going to be centered, right? We're going to put the Y location at the bottom, so height, it's going to fill the entire width of the window. Maybe it's going to have a height of 20. So now we have a ground. Now, of course, the ground is being affected by gravity, so let's make our collider for the ground static, like we did for the wall in the other example. Okay. And now we have a ground object, and we can see that our little block here is now getting, is now staying on the ground. It bumps a little bit, and then this is what the physics simulation does. Okay. So what we'll do for this this demonstration is we're going to try to grab this object with our mouse and then drag it around. Okay. And then we'll add some more objects to the world, maybe some balls that fall from the top or something that can interact with our object as we're dragging it. Okay, just to demonstrate again, playing around with the sprite object and some of its functionalities. So one thing that's really cool about p5play is that every object in the game includes, in the world, in the p5play world, includes its own mouse objects. And what that allows us to do is we can do things like ask if the mouse is hovering or being clicked on an object, something like this. objects will be able to tell us that information without us having to do any special programming. So let's demonstrate. Okay? We're going to go into draw and we're going to say, all right, let's take a look at our block, and we'll say if block.mouse. So every object contains a mouse object that we can use to ask questions about what is the mouse doing inside that object. Okay? So for example, there is a hovering function. So we'll say if block.mouse.hovering, which means if is the mouse hovering over the block. Okay? We're going to do something simple here. We're going to say take the global mouse object. Okay? So this is the global mouse object, and we're going to change its cursor attribute. Okay? So this cursor attribute, these are HTML cursor attributes. You can look them up. There's a few of them that you can use. There's one called grab. These are kind of like standard, the way the cursor changes here. I have an arrow, and then when I'm over text, my cursor changes to the little text cursor, right? There's a few different of these cursors, like the hand, right, that the software is able to use. We can control that using mouse.cursor. So for example, if my cursor moves over the box here, now I get to have the hand cursor. And then we'll say when we're no longer hovering, right? So we'll say else. So if we're not hovering, then the else means we're not hovering. We'll say mouse.cursor equals default. So this is really cool because up until now, we've had to do this ourselves in P5. If we wanted to know if the mouse was over a shape, we had to write our own code using if statements and the location of the mouse and what we knew about that shape's position and size to ask that question. With p5play, we get that for free as a bonus. So any object, any sprite object in p5play contains its own mouse object that we can use to create different types of interactions. So here we're able to detect if the mouse is hovering this box here at the bottom. Okay? But then there's more, right? We could say, for example, we can say if block.mouse is dragging, right? What if we have a dragging behavior, which is we're hovering, but then we're also clicking and dragging. Okay? Let's respond to that. We're going to tell the block to move towards mouse.x, mouse.y. So just in this example, we're going to use the global mouse object instead of using P5's mouse x, mouse y, but both of them would work the same. Okay? So we'll say move towards mouse.x, mouse.y. So now if I click and drag, I can grab this object, and if I release it, it's going to fall down to the ground. Very neat. So I can move that object around now as I'm dragging, and if I release my mouse cursor, I no longer move towards the mouse, right? So that object will fall down. Now, one interesting thing we can do also with the built-in mouse object is that notice something interesting happens here if I click the corner of my object and then move my mouse. You see what happens? It sort of like gets teleported, right? Because the location of the object is moving its center towards the mouse location. So the mouse object that is inside my block, right? Its X and Y value represents the location of the mouse relative to the center of the object. Okay? So what that means is we could say instead of moving towards mouse X and mouse Y, we could move towards mouse X plus block.mouse.x and then plus block.mouse.y for the Y. Okay. And let's move these separately. And what that's going to allow us to do here, this is just so we can read this line a bit more easily. That's going to allow us to kind of take into account the offset, right? Where is the mouse located relative to the center of this block, so that when we're moving, right, we're moving towards a different point now. Cool. And it doesn't look like as if the object is now just kind of jumping over all of a sudden. Okay. All right. Okay. So we can use, right, the built-in mouse object inside all of our sprites to do these kinds of mouse interactions. There's also different ones. If we look at the documentation, let's jump over here to learn, and input, and then there's Sprite.mouse, right? There's different different events that we can use. Hovers, hovering, dragging. There's also mouse mouse pressing, released. Okay, so different input states that can be used, and we can also do the same with the keyboard. Of course, there's p5play as its own keyboard object. Also has a controller object for game controllers, which we may explore in the future, and has a touches object for touchscreen input. So if you're building a game for, let's say, mobile phones, and you want to use the touchscreen, you can do that also. All right, go back to our sketch here. Okay, so we have an object. We can move it around with our mouse, and if I release the mouse, it falls back down. So just to kind of cover a few other ideas here, we're going to add some objects that kind of fall down from the sky, and we'll see how they interact with our block object. So here we're going to, because we're also on the topic of input, so here we'll say, let's put a comment. So check if the mouse is hovering over the block. Check if block is being dragged by the mouse. If so, follow the mouse. Okay. And then here we're going to use the built-in keyboard object. Okay, so there's a keyboard object that we can use, and we're going to check if we're if a key is being pressed. Okay. So actually the keyboard object looks for specific keys being pressed. So this is not what I want to do. So we'll just use the key pressed function then in P5. Okay, so never mind. We can always use both. So the keyboard object in p5play would be useful if you wanted to know, like, is the left key being pressed or the right key and so forth. Here we're just going to respond to any key being pressed, and whenever I hit any key on my keyboard, we're going to get some new sprite to appear here at the top of the screen, and we're going to get those to just fall down. Okay, so let's make a new sprite. We'll call it a ball. So we'll make a sprite. Its x value, we're going to make it random based on the width, so anywhere from left to right. Its y value maybe will be equal to -50, so it's going to start right above the top of the screen. And its diameter, let's make it equal to 40. Okay, so we'll get a ball that falls down. So now if I press some keys on my keyboard, I'm going to have these balls that fall down from the top, and then that are just going to get piled over my my box here. Now notice something interesting here, right? That's happening is that as the balls are hitting my object, by default, objects in P5, just like the p5play, just like they did in the other example we built, they will rotate when objects hit them. Okay? So sometimes that can be desirable, sometimes that can be what you want. Notice also over time, as it gets hit by more balls, it's sort of like falling further away from the mouse cursor a little bit. So that's kind of interesting. So objects, right, will get hit like this, and they will rotate by default. We can change this. So if we go into our block, when we create the block here, we're going to say block.rotation lock equals true. So this is going to lock the object from rotating. It's still going to be affected by the physics, but now it can no longer spin around its center. So this would be very useful, for example, if you're trying to build like a platform kind of game and you want to have little platforms that your object will be able to, your characters will be able to jump on and so forth. Now, one thing that's happening, you can see, right, as there's more weight on the object, as there's more of these circles piling on, my platform is just naturally falling down. If I release my cursor, it's just going to fall down here. So we can change the collider of our object in P5. So we have 3 different colliders. We have static, where these objects just simply, they just don't get moved by anything, but they can impact other objects. We have kinematic, where objects can be animated, but they will not respond to the physics of others. And then we have dynamic, which is the default. So let's experiment with that a little bit. We'll see when the mouse is hovering, right? We're going to make the, 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 we're going to make over our object, over our mouse. So actually maybe when we'll say maybe when it's being dragged, let's do it here. We're going to say block.collider. We're going to change into a kinematic collider so that our objects can pile onto it and they won't be able to push it down. Okay. And then if we're not dragging the block, we're going to say block.collider equals dynamic. Okay. So we can switch back and forth between different collider types as the program is running, depending on what we're trying to do. Okay. So notice now, oops, my guy went a little bit far. Notice now if I get a bunch of these circles piling on, right, my block is no longer falling down from the weight because it's now a kinematic collider, which means it will impact objects in the simulation, but it's not being impacted by others. And then as soon as we release the cursor, it goes back to being a dynamic object that things can bump into. Now, sometimes the simulation can get a little bit wonky, right? So if I do these very quick movement of my mouse, that actually creates a pretty big velocity on the object. These are things that you can start to play with once you tweak the physics attributes of the objects, things like the friction, the mass, things like this. But by default, things can get pretty bouncy. For example, there's an attribute called bouciness, and all of these are in the documentation, which again is very easy to explore. So bounciness, right, by if we add, I think bounciness of 1 is the maximum bounciness factor. So that makes the objects like super bouncy when they hit the ground, kind of almost like too bouncy, right? Let's reduce this a little bit. So sprites, right, have all of these different physics attributes that can be tweaked to change how objects are behaving, how much drag frictions they are when they're running against an edge, what's their internal mass that affects the physics simulation, things like this. Cool. Now, one thing you may have noticed here that I just did is that when I grab my object, right, I was moving towards the mouse. If I make a very quick motion and then release my cursor, this is going to apply a ton of velocity to my block, and it's going to cause it to just go flying off. Okay? So again, these are things that as you're programming with p5play, you start to learn how to experiment with. So for example, we could say, we're going to say if block.mouse, let's bring up the documentation here. We have the mouse. We have released, I believe, that we can use. So released, so that means that's going to trigger when the mouse has been released from the object. Okay, we're going to say block, and we'll just take its velocity and we're going to reset it to 0. So velocity is the speed of the block. Okay, so I think that should work. We're going to grab the block, and then even if I give it now a big swing up towards the top of the screen, right? As soon as I release it, its velocity goes back down to 0, and it's just going to float. It's instead of floating off the screen, oops, I guess sometimes it will still happen. Its velocity went back down to 0, and now it's falling back down. Okay. So basically learning to work with p5play is getting to know the sprite object, getting to know all the different things a sprite can do, and then how to manipulate it to create some behavior in the game, and then combining that with collision detection to create actual gameplay. All right. So this was a quick example just to show you some of the special mouse and input features that we have with p5play. In particular, right, this idea that we can now ask objects if the mouse is interacting with them using their internal mouse object, which is very cool. So we can do things like click and drag, for instance, or we'd be able to know if we released a specific object like this. And of course, we can always be adding more sprite objects anytime. So we'll wrap it here for this example. We're going to do one more this week where we're going to talk about this idea of groups in P5, and I will see you in the next one.